Consider why any of you even work. Why do you get up every day to go to an establishment that you don't care about, doing things that you don't care about for 8 hours every day when those 8 hours could easily be spent on something that you do care about? Why do you do it? Well, the simple fact is obligation. You have to, or you don't get food. Working is not a choice. If you believe it is a choice, you don't understand how starvation works. You, in this world, either go without any food, go without any money, or you work a job. There's no two ways around it unless you can get neat bucks somehow, which often requires a lawyer to receive. Basically, if you're born into the world with no money, you're fucked. And the United States is a country in which the rate of people who are in poverty and go out of poverty is at the same level as India and Bangladesh. So it's unlikely that if you're in poverty now that you're going to get out of poverty. That's just how things are. If you're lucky enough, you can find a way to get neat bucks, but without a lawyer, the likelihood of that actually happening is very small. And so, how do we get out of this? Well, there's no simple answer. A lot of the time you can't. A lot of the time you're simply bound to the system as it is because the system is an immoral structure in place of taking your life away. Consider the fact that much of the labor that you do is not even given back to you. The value of it is not even given back to you. The person who works over you, the capitalist, the boss, whichever, very little of the time are they doing anything that is equal to what you are doing. Oftentimes they're just sitting over there and penny pitching and watching everybody work under them. Very rarely are they doing anything of real substantial value in comparison to the value that you are creating with your labor. Now consider the idea that the materials that this man accumulates for you are the only thing that he really accumulates. The labor, or the fruits of that labor, let's say a desk that you built or something like that, that is value and time that you've put into it. Now, let's say that, for example, in this case, that person working over you did not do any of that work themselves. The only thing that they provided with the materials was, very cheap materials, not even that big of a deal. Well, that person working over you has to make a profit somehow, because if they, weren't making a profit, then why would they be participating in the system in the first place? At that point, they'd be running some kind of co-op or something. The intention here is to extract as much productivity from you and then receive as much money in return. The contradiction of this system is that the worker themselves needs to provide enough value and get paid enough to end up coming back. But the value that they've spent working on that thing, the value that is reaped from that thing, is never truly going to be given back to them, because they themselves are not the boss. The boss is the one who's going to make all the money, because the boss has the materials and you don't. And so because of the fact that you don't have the materials, they are going to have you work, and so they pay you what is called a wage. And so you get that wage, sure, but you don't actually get the value of what you have built. You don't actually get the value of the work you put into it. And this is called exploitation. And so, given the fact that you spend so much time in a day at work, 8 hours, and that so much productivity is being put into an item that you cannot even truly reap the benefits of, what's the point of doing it every day? Because at that point, you're just being exploited as a worker. And if that's the case, then why are you coming home so stressed every single day without even any energy to participate in your hobbies? 8 out of 10 Americans suffer from workplace stress. Think about that. That's 8 out of 10 people who come home almost completely unable to participate in many of the things that they love the most. I'm talking about artists who have to stay awake until 1 a.m. in order to finish their project, just so they can hope to be able to receive some sort of mainstream success. And then that mainstream success is already dictated by market forces that are keeping them from making what they want to make. And so they end up having to sleep at 1 a.m. just to wake up at 7 a.m. or 6 a.m. That's, that's 5 hours of sleep that they've gotten. And oftentimes people have to work two jobs just to make enough money, because the minimum wage is not a living wage, and people who work minimum wage jobs are often not entry-level employees because there's just no jobs for these people, and because college is privatized, they can't afford to get into college. So it ends up having this endless cycle of people not being able to go to school because their family didn't make any money, and then that family can't get out of poverty in the first place because they can't go to school. So you just have this endless cycle of people who are born into poverty and then can't get out of poverty. And so they end up having to work exorbitant amounts just to stay alive. And so when it comes to things that they're actually passionate about, there's a deficit of it because they can't do those things, or else they just don't survive. They don't have enough energy to allocate towards those things and to get enough sleep. And so in a system such as this, where so much of your life is taken away, if you live up to 70 years, 21% of your life is being taken away. If you live up to 50 years, 35% of your life is being taken away. Think about that. Think about how much of your life you are not putting towards something that you actually want to do. It's way too much. Far, far too much of your life is going towards something that you do not care about, that is killing your soul, that you don't care to care about. And so, the message of this video is to say that you are not morally obligated to work. You are not morally obligated to line the pockets of some boss that doesn't care about you, that only cares about extracting as much wealth from you as he possibly can. And the only way in which you could be morally obligated to do this is if you're, relying on a family, if you're potentially having a family of your own. That's a situation in which you just cannot do anything else other than work. And if you're having a family, I would have recommended, trying to get an education to get a job that you actually want, or trying to pursue your passion enough until it's, monetarily stable. But, you didn't really make that leap yet. And if you're living with your parents, what I would consider doing then is to try and get some sort of disability, get some sort of need bucks, because you can pretend to have schizophrenia. And that's another thing. There's no shame, absolutely no shame, in faking any sort of disability to get need bucks. And there's a reason why. Because consider first of all, where that money comes from. Big companies who are committing horrible atrocities in the third world. So many of these companies are, for example, Coca-Cola, they've had death squads funded inside of factories in Colombia. The reason they did that was because their workers were trying to unionize and get better working conditions so they didn't die on the job, or so they actually got wages to feed their family. There are several companies in the third world that have put their workers in such horrifying working conditions that they just can't survive oftentimes. And the reason why this is done is because it's cheaper for the capitalist in America to be able to extract that labor from a third world country. Third world countries don't have a lot of money. And so these capitalists in the USA, they can, basically rig the system in that other country to get politicians that support their agenda, and then companies can just exploit those poor people as much as they possibly want, because you get the politicians in who support their agenda, and then working conditions don't pass through in Parliament because we're against that. That's what we're about here. We're all about getting paid by that first world money. So the third world gets astronomically worse, and then in the case of countries that rebel against the totalitarian nature of these companies end up getting blown up. We've seen many, many times the West tries to justify blowing up a third world country. They say, oh, they have chemical weapons, oh, they're censoring their people or something like that, despite the fact that the US oftentimes is the biggest state sponsor of both terrorism and authoritarianism throughout the world. Think of ISIS. Who funds ISIS? The US. There's evidence that goes back to Barack Obama funding ISIS, and that is an institution that has killed and raped many women and children, despite the fact that the US claims to be some sort of moral arbiter of freedom and democracy. And then we ally with the Saudis, someone who has, just recently killed a journalist. That's, sure, great freedom of the press right there. And then we go and criticize China for not having freedom of the press, but the Saudis don't. We love the Saudis because they give us oil, they give us labor, and we take arms deals with them, and they're against Iran. And so, we're able to say that that's such a great ally that we love and all these other things, and then turn around and say that China is now this horrible thing just because they oppose the US's political beliefs. They oppose the US's understanding of how the world should be. They're a competing capitalist power. And, we see the same thing with Russia, Iran, etc. It's not because these places are totalitarian, which they are, but that's not the reason why the US is against them. The reason why the US is against them is because they oppose what the US wants, which is more money. That's always what it is. Why did the war in Iraq happen? More money. We want that oil, we want that labor. Why is Venezuela being so horribly attacked by US-backed groups and by the US itself? Because we want that labor. Venezuela nationalized the oil industry, and because of that nationalization, U.S. companies cannot come in and exploit those resources. We want those natural resources as cheap as we can so we can make as much profit. It doesn't matter what the environment says, it doesn't matter what the people want. All we care about is extracting as much profit from those places, and we will do anything, even if it requires war, to get those things. Another great example of this is Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. He had given up all of his chemical weapons. He had given up his nuclear weapons just so he could, fight in the quote-unquote war on terrorism. He was, great friends with Bush and all that. But in 2011, he had been killed by US-funded rebels. The reason for that was because Gaddafi was against economic imperialism. Despite the fact that he did try to bring in more US investment, there was still a large degree of the country that was nationalized, and he posed a threat to the US's hegemonic order. He wanted to create a pan-African currency that would rival the US dollar, which was, again, completely against the US's the US's interests, because if a currency that spanned all across Africa were to come about, that would give Africa much more power and autonomy and rely less on the exploitation of the US, which would be very dangerous for the US's interests in the country, or in the continent rather, because the US would not be able to get those cheap resources and those cheap people as easily. And so those companies up there that are getting taxed, that are giving you your neat bucks, all that money is going to go to is another jet to blow up a third world country. All it's going to go to is for the FBI and the NSA to continue watching you and monitoring your every move, and, for the president to get another check to continue blowing up people in third world countries. So, if anything, it's the people who actually pay the taxes who are the immoral ones. So I don't think you should feel at all bad for exploiting the system at hand, because the people who work over you, the bosses, they're immoral. The companies themselves are immoral. The state is immoral. And so by staying out of a job, which is, again, exploiting you and is immoral, and by exploiting the state, all you're doing is taking away money from an already immoral institution that was going to, as I said, use that money on a jet to blow up another third world country. So there's nothing wrong with getting meat bucks, even if you lie, because at the end of the day, that money is going to go to something far worse. And if you work a job, then you're really just wasting your time on something that you don't want to do when you could easily be doing something that fulfills your life and that you enjoy.